So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, now it is time for the final session that will culminate this conference. During yesterday and today, we have been talking a lot about internal dynamics in the EU. The previous session expanded the horizon to some degree to the closest partners outside the Union. But there is also the whole world out there that we haven't been talking about much. And while the EU has been absorbed by all the internal crises over the past several years, the world has become a more dangerous place. In Estonia, for one, we are definitely aware of the comeback of something you may call realist geopolitics, which is putting this part of Europe on alert, among others. In the EU, we are hearing these days a lot of talk about defense and about protection. And this, as such, is quite a change in rhetoric compared to, say, 10 years ago, when you hardly ever heard about these issues by the Commission, for example. What we often hear nowadays is that the liberal global order is under threat, possibly about to vanish. And at the same time, we are interconnected and interdependent, not just internally in Europe, but also with other parts of the world in ways we have never experienced before. So the final question for the final keynote speech is, how does the EU navigate in such unstable waters? So I am proud to introduce now our final keynote speaker. Anne Deighton is Emeritus Professor of European International Politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, and a fellow of Wolfson College in Oxford. Anne has published extensively on the Cold War, on European integration, on British foreign policy, and on contemporary European security issues. And she has been a visiting professor in many European universities and is also an elected member of the Norwegian Academy of Letters and Sciences. And the topic of Professor Deighton's speech is Looking In, Looking Out, the EU in a Turbulent World. And please.
Thank you very much indeed. It's actually a horrible experience to be a Brit in the EU today, I have to tell you. It's the most difficult phase of my academic career. And it's a great privilege to be speaking here, but like Chris Bickerton, you wonder if you're ever going to come back. However, it's useful to be a Brit in the European Union for once, because we've become a bit of a problem rather than problem solvers. I'm not going to speak for very long because I know that there are a fleet of taxis waiting to take people to the airport or to the ferry, perhaps, I don't know. But let me just start by reminding ourselves of the big picture. It's an incredibly important year for the European Union, not because of all the troubles that we Brits have brought upon you and that you have brought upon yourselves sometimes. It's 60 years since the EU was created, and we must keep the longue durée, the big picture in mind. But the EU remains an institution. It's not a state. We are in what Robert Cooper once called the postmodern world. It doesn't feel like it sometimes, and not entirely locked into the Westphalian idea of the nation-state. But the nation-state is still alive and kicking, and state building is certainly not a completed operation globally. As Brigitte Laffan said, domestic politics dominates still. But it's the principles behind the European Union that we have to think about. A voluntary association emerging from self-inflicted wars in the first half of the 20th century. It is a so-called peace project, knowing the need for economic growth to secure peace and indeed to channel into integration. And it's now the rules of the European Union which shape it, whether or not we look at borders, or as Brigitte Laffan was saying recently, just now, rules that spill over borders. The rules are sometimes applied flexibly, but this project is not meant to be an easy one, as Professor Amato reminded us yesterday. This isn't just a safe haven. This is a constantly discussed, negotiated, quarreled about project. But rules are of huge importance. For the EU, like everyone else in the international system, has to balance the demand by citizens and states for order, with rules on the one hand, and justice. The desire for order is driven by a fear of the unknown, or indeed sometimes by the fear of the known threat. The system demands this. Citizens demand this. At the same time as they want security and order, they demand justice, social justice, economic justice, legal justice. These views are paramount. And sometimes they compete very, very passionately. Citizens want, therefore, to be secure. They want to feel their basic human rights and their identity will be protected. This is a perpetually tricky demand, with often those very competing priorities. Just let me remind you very, very quickly of some of the issues that we've looked at yesterday and today. This conference has laid bare not the technical, how we get from A to B, how we manage to bury a difficult problem, but it's laid bare some of the core issues of European integration. I noted that we're still discussing definitions, and problems abound surrounding definitions. Definitions are often overlapping. We were reminded, and those of you who have been speakers may hear your voice echoed back through what I say, through remembering the difference, for example, between the SEM, the European Single Market, and the Eurozone, how we define a nation state, populism, nativism. Very nice little discussion about that this morning. It's brought us looking in at old problems, institutions, structures, as well as looking out. And I was very taken by the overlap between the panels. I noted that Luc Middelaar, whose name I'm probably pronouncing correctly, forgive me, emphasized the political potential and the realities of the Commission as a political institution at the moment. And Mr. Svoboda talked about the European Union looking over the shoulders of nation states. Whether you just look over the shoulder or whether you take action is a very topical issue. Mario Laurestin reminded us that the European Union both gives crisis responses, sometimes pretty slow, but sometimes it's better to be slow than over hasty, and at least we haven't issued Twitter instructions to Mr. Juncker or to any of his senior colleagues, because we'd be in a terrible Twittering world then if we were all to act like some of our leaders do. We've also instructed ourselves to keep within our core mandate. So we've given ourselves a heavy task. Brigitte Laffan talked about refashioning the Union, and Stefan Lehn, the dangers of referendums, both of which I agree, but these are issues that are very long, strategic, political, and serious issues, which cannot just be addressed by bureaucrats, but have to be addressed by the input of academics, philosophers, political scientists, sociologists, and even economists to try and sort out and find a way forward. And one of the new factors which I noticed coming through in the institutional and indeed the populist debate was that of a desire for leadership. It seems to me, as my experience as a historian, that when institutions or states are in some kind of crisis or rapid transition, they start muttering about leadership, either having too much of it, not enough of it, or the wrong people doing it, quite often the third one. We also looked at the economy, and there, many of the issues are very old friends. Does politics dominate economics? Does economics actually dominate politics? Martin Sandbu made the good point that people need voice, even if you're talking about economics, and I thought he showed a nice way of talking about economics in a way that was intelligible to the citizens here in Tallinn and beyond across the European Union. The economists had as a subtext, which was so obvious it hardly needed mentioning, but I think it should be mentioned, that political integration needs economic growth. You cannot cut a cake unless there is a prospect that there will be enough cake for everyone. You have to understand that we British are obsessed currently by cake, since our venerable, honourable and much observed Foreign Secretary talked about having your cake and eating it. Did I mention that the other things the Brits do very well in the European Union is irony? We decided in the economic sessions that not only did we have to try to sort out divergences between different parts of the Union, and it's an extraordinarily huge and differentiated union that we have, but we also have to sort out the overall direction. And I thought that Raina Kattle's presentation on exotic, unthought through as yet, ideas for investment rather than sticking it in a bank, or as we do in Britain at the moment with our poor pound sterling, put it under the mattress, that we have to think out of the box. We have to think in ways that may surprise ourselves and will almost certainly surprise the bureaucrats. So we have to have confidence as a union. And then we've had this last quite controversial session on the neighbourhood with Ambassador Christopherson explaining that enlargement of any sort is a long way away. Well, enlargement has been on the agenda since the European Union, then the European Economic Community, was created 60 years ago. It's never gone off the agenda. And I think that it is part of being an institution, not a state. It's a very important part of being an institution, not a state. Attila Erlap gave a very fiery account of Turkey's internal domestic problems as well as its role in the world. And in the same way, the most impressive young woman who I expect and I hope will be Prime Minister of her country before very long, Svetlana Kobzar, talked about being a frontline state or a bridge. She used the word bridge. Others would use frontline state. Then Steve Blockmans did, as think tankers are always meant to do. He stirred the pudding. You have to be very careful what you hope for. He's probably left. I hope he's left to commiserate with himself. He's here. Good, good. Well, I say to you, sir, beware of what you hope for. Beware of the unintended consequences of saying definitively yes, definitively no. On the one hand, if you start to draw definitive borders, those who favor the EU as an international institution will begin to suspect it's starting to look like a state. That's one thing that you have to be very careful of. And mischievously, I was reminded that in Polsec circles, off-the-record circles in London, there are many talking now about building a web of bilateral relations within the European Union and beyond. And I put a little asterisk in the side of my margin to send back to Whitehall. 1945 to 1956, the Anglo-Turkish relationship was at its most powerful. If you want to start recreating the past, that might be one way of doing it. So we have to be careful. Overall, the impression I've taken from this very dynamic conference is that we are still looking at different approaches within the framework that we know. No one, and Steve Blockmans, I'm sure if he'd been given another 10 minutes, would have done it himself, has said, what would he do if the European Union disappeared altogether? Would we not be having conferences, reinventing it, perhaps in a different formulation, but maybe not? So, as an institution that is designed to be clumsy, slow, and with a lot of buck passing from the Commission itself and from other institutions, we have to be quite careful. But I want to add a new ingredient, because as a Brit, I've been thinking about these issues in a different way, very intently over the last year or so. I think to understand the European Union's place in this turbulent world, as I call it, we have to remember that every member state comes to the Union or sits on the border of the Union with its own baggage of history. I'm not going to give a history lecture, I'd love to, but I won't. History is important, though, to us to understand, not to relive, but to understand, to overcome. Europe was a continent of empires, overseas empires and empires nearer at home. One British historian called the Europeans busy and bossy, and it's a pretty apt description. By empires, to play the definitions game, of course I mean the domination in some way of one state over another. Now, of course, every state has to learn to understand and live with its past. But ultimately, every state has to learn to overcome the historical baggage of that past. Whether the state was a colonizer, whether it was colonized, whether it was an outsider observer of empires and of their consequences. If we cannot overcome our own pasts, we cannot genuinely be part of a common future. And there is not a single EU member state, which I can think of, perhaps some have got some ideas of this, which does not have some traces of either its own imperial past or of another state's imperial past. Traces that lurk in the perceptions and sometimes the actions of government. What makes up our national identity does matter. Dealing with it appropriately also matters. Of course, wars can overcome empires, and wars can overcome an imperial mindset, but they can reinforce past images of imperial glory. In the UK, success in the Second World War reinforced its image of itself. Now, I'm not going to tell anyone else how to behave. I speak as a British citizen, and I think that for the British, the issue of overcoming our own imperial past has been extraordinarily painful, and it is still ongoing, and it is not talked about enough. In the 1950s, the British thought that their already disappearing empire and their fancy new Commonwealth would insulate them from the need to be inside the European Union as it then was. The war had reinforced our notions about our own law, common law, our own diplomatic prowess, and our own capacity to build alliances. When they realized that they were wrong, they were dismayed that their global reach and their importance did not allow them easy access to European Union membership. Remember, we tried over a period of more than 10 years to join, and when I made this point when I was giving a talk in Finland, many people were surprised. Younger people have forgotten that. We also had lots of efforts to create free trade areas, and there's a sort of feeling that the past is being reimagined. Many imperial and post-imperial powers also have expectations of how others will treat them, and this has consequences. I cannot finish this address without looking a bit more at Britain. Our Danish friend put up a pretty good account of where we are. But for us in Britain, the Brexit issue has caused the greatest storm in British politics for at least a century, and it's not over yet. It may have damaging effects on the European, and Chris Bickerton pointed out that it will have an effect also on the international system. It will certainly shake up Britain. The irony of this cannot be lost on anyone with a modicum of interest in international politics. After all, it was the United States and the United Kingdom, between them, with much support from elsewhere, that drove the construction of the very post-war international system in which we still live. From the United Nations to the reinvention of the International Labour Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, the OEEC, that then became the OECD, the Council of Europe, NATO. I won't consider here whether what we are now living through is an outcrop, a result of changes in this wider international system and appreciation of international organizations. But it is epitomized in some what may call its most grotesque fashion in President Trump's USA. The question that we are still asking ourselves, why is it that we who found a new voice after the Second World War through international organizations are now seeking to pull out? Much polling has been done on the why question in Britain, and we have a long list of possible reasons for the narrow leave vote. Age, the older tend to vote against. Regional variation, educational attainment cannot be considered not important enough. The education dynamic for advanced societies should never be underestimated. Populism, or what I will now call nativism, our rackety electoral system and its poor reflection of feelings in general elections, the list goes on, manipulation of the system, of which it appears that there was more than we knew about at the time, bad luck, general discontent with the Westminster establishment, and funnily enough, a discontent that was aimed very largely at MPs and peers in the House of Lords, those very same people who are now given such enormous burdens of carrying through Brexit, of elites, etc. The list goes on. The dichotomy, however, for me, is not just between those dilemmas within one nation state and being a member state, as Chris Bickerton, to cite him again. I don't think that dichotomy completely fits the bill. It's my own view that the imperial past, to which I have alluded, is a powerful factor. We forget what a large power we were. In the post-war period, we ended our vast empire from India, Ceylon, Palestine, which we only took on board after the First World War, Malaya, swathes of Africa, east of Suez, Hong Kong. The brilliant writer Jan Morris, who observed, she went out there to watch it going on, observed the leaving of Hong Kong, remarked in a most perceptive way that the lowering of the Union Jack in Hong Kong was like some obscure avant-garde movie, and she had no idea what the plot was really about. A very astute remark. As we lost our empire over the same time that we were negotiating with and for the European communities, we replaced this with our now renowned obsession about leadership. Leadership became the cultural and psychological dummy for those losing empire. I won't take us through, but it was one of the reasons that the Labour government was so disdainful of the first European coal and steel community. It was cooked up in France and West Germany, and the Americans were told before the British, fatal. We heard about leadership in spadesful over the decades that followed. Particularly under Thatcher was most memorable, under Major, sitting at the heart of Europe, and indeed under Tony Blair, whose speeches are littered with references to the necessity of Britain playing the role of the global leader, even as we became the awkward partner in the European Union. Although when we were in the Union, we were actually quite good at managing balance of power, in the old-fashioned terms, relationships between many of our partners. The French and German amongst you will know what I'm talking about. And of course we do. We do have cultural and power political tools in our pockets. We have good old English language. And just remember, that's an imperial inheritance which has become most acute in the United States, one of our long-abandoned colonies. Our trade links, indeed. Five Eyes, if you don't know about Five Eyes, you should know. A nuclear deterrent, because that was what those at the top table had, even if the chances of ever being able to set it off by ourselves are pretty remote. Fairly substantial hard power resources, some of which are even at this moment in Estonia. An international and sophisticated advanced educational system at university level. However, I would suggest to you, and I don't talk about any other post-imperial powers, I leave you to draw your own conclusions, that we have not quite yet managed to change our political culture in the UK. A political culture that stretches back to our colonization of America, to our post-World War mandates, and in the former Ottoman Empire. I personally find it deeply ironic that as the European Union expanded eastwards, we expected those countries which had been under communist control and which often hadn't had democratic regimes before that, to change their political cultures and to adapt to the European Union, a point that Peter Boras pointed out very eloquently. And yet, even as we expected others to reinvent themselves, we have had terrible difficulties in reinventing ourselves as genuine Europeans. We are very reluctant to make a national compromise. So what do we say as we negotiate over Brexit? We can be Empire 2, global Britain, global free trade power, leader of new states navigating the oceans like the small ships of the small English ships that navigated against the Spanish galleons in the Spanish Armada of the 16th century. Flexible, adaptable, click of a fingers, conjuring up a new free trade area or two. And never mind the inappropriate mutterings about from Kipling, which were made in Myanmar. Prime Minister May did tone down this type of analysis for the first time when in Florence, and I just actually had an email message today that Chika Umina, the Labour, who is a pro-European, wants to give a talk about reinventing Britain not as a major global power, but as a major European power. Very interesting what he's going to say. But I tell you, my friends, we in Britain are still talking to ourselves about Brexit. Brexit was a plan, but it wasn't a strategy. The decision to leave was a decision to leave without a serious decision of knowing where we were going. Of course, we have to settle the domestic basis of our new foreign policy, but we have not got out of the trauma in which we placed ourselves with our referendum. If you read, for example, waiting at the airport for your aeroplanes, the new security paper that the British have released to deal with Brexit. When I first read it, I thought someone was playing a joke on me. It read like an application to join CFSP, to join your Pole Mill initiatives, except that there was that tweak in the tail that we want our very special relationship with you, one all of our own. The EU-UK-NATO relationship is going to require some very, very careful handling, especially if the Turkey scenario proceeds in the way that some were talking about. We cannot get away from the fact that when we were in the European Union and today, we had the best deal we could ever get. It ain't going to get any better for the Brits. And that's something that we as a country, a stubborn country, are going to have to learn. If we realize that the end of empire and all that goes with it globally, if we realize this, that it cannot last, we have to reinvent ourselves as a powerful regional power that must learn to cooperate, compete for markets. Many other states have had these discussions. The French, very cleverly, picked up on the European community itself as their post-imperial project. Those of you from imperial powers, and that's probably very nearly everyone in this room, will know where their post-imperial hang-ups are. I don't know what the outcomes will be. I have a hunch that much as I despise referendums, we may need to have another referendum in the United Kingdom. But the question I have for you, my friends, in the European Union, is that if we do have another EU referendum on the EU, and if the EU is still there with its economic growth and good idea to sustain its citizens, its trading companies and its guests, and it is still plying its norms for EU thinking about the world, the EU adventure, the question I have for you is, would you have us back? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your insights, for your historical perspective, for the geographical scope of what you talked about. Speaking about whether we still need Brits, I can tell you one of the difficulties in organizing this conference was to avoid having too many Brits in the program, because the intellectual contribution that you make in Europe is just so impressive. So thank you once again for coming. Now we still have some time for questions to Professor Anne Deighton. So please, anyone in the audience, while you are thinking, I would have a question.
I've reduced everyone to silence. You're thinking about your own post-imperial pasts.
Yeah, I hope you are not worrying about whether you catch your flights. The buses will be leaving at 4 sharp, and we will end before then, so no worries about that. But what I would like you to reflect a bit more upon, you mentioned that the way the UK is now discussing its future relationship with EU foreign and security policy looks pretty much like they still see themselves as part of it.
Yeah. The CFSP and the whole security dimension was very much left out of the referendum campaign. It was barely discussed. The issues turned around law, sovereignty, trade, migration. The issues about managing, playing a role in keeping our world more or less stable were virtually ignored. And this has only now recently come onto the agenda. I hope you will stick with us. But I fear very much that many of the decisions, and those of you who know about crisis management will know exactly what I mean, that many of the decisions and the impulses for action are made informally in those so-called corridors of power or over a beer or over, I don't know, chips and mayonnaise in Brussels somewhere, and the British won't be there. We may be there lurking outside the door or invited to participate, but I think for us to play our role is going to be a tall order, and it is not enough to say, it's okay, we've got NATO. Because NATO itself is under considerable threat. It's under considerable threat from forces outside NATO, new forms of warfare, cyber warfare, and others. But as we know, without pursuing this much further, it is under threat from some of the members of NATO, who, although not hostile, are unpredictable in how they wish the sources of American power, military power, to be deployed on any occasion. So it will be a huge problem, I think.
Thank you. We have now 2 questions from the audience. Eva, Raik first.
Thank you. Great Britain is not important only today and yesterday. We know from history that for Baltic states and particularly for Estonia, Great Britain, England was the best partner and a friend in struggle for our independence and in being also in Europe. And that's why we are very sorry that Great Britain is leaving, and probably from Great Britain, Little England will stay, or something like that. And that's why I am asking, when do you predict that Great Britain is ready for a next referendum? Because from past we know that there was 2 referendums after accession also. Thank you.
Let's take immediately another question, and then you can answer both. Marju Lauristin, please.
Really, thank you very much. Really, I don't have a question. I wanted to thank you for the speech, and I want to thank UK for being, like Ivar said, very important part of Europe for us. Europe for us is not the same after Brexit. That's not economically. It's about values. And from other side, values are what are uniting us. And being an academic area that doesn't know borders, it is not depending on institutional solutions. And in this sense, I suppose that in the European research area, we can continue and maybe now even having, in this sense, a bit new relationship. We will have UK as a critical voice, even more cherished than before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Referendums, yes, we didn't have a referendum before we went in to the European Union, unlike the Danes and the Norwegians who said no. And then, of course, the French had a referendum as to whether they wanted us in. But we had it in 1975, and it was a pretty cooked-up event. It was not equally funded between the 2 sides, but we decided to stay in. But the issue has not gone away. It's been lurking around since the turn of the century. Blair thought he might have a referendum. In 2005, there were commitments for some kind of referendum or parliamentary discussion if further integration took place. And then we had what can, in the most polite terms, be called a foul-up of a referendum, which was appallingly badly conducted. For example, the concessions made by the Europeans to us, to David Cameron, those were not discussed. They disappeared from the agenda. Perhaps they were considered too technical, although to opt out of ever closer political union didn't sound very technical to me. We didn't run it well. We'd allowed 16-year-olds to vote in the Scottish referendum. We didn't allow them to vote this time round. The Remain campaign was badly conducted, and many academics like myself were continually writing letters to the national press complaining about the way in which the referendum was being conducted. Some of the advertising came close to outright racism. It was not a pretty sight in British politics. However, it may be that only a referendum can trump a referendum. Those voices of the 52%, those minds can only, in my view, be asked to reconsider by a referendum, I fear. If not, it will have to be through Parliament. And so far, we haven't been promised anything very substantial through the parliamentary system. The question when is a really good one. My own view is that transition is a waste of time until you know where you're transiting to. You know, it seems to me you can't have a transition. We've spent a year messing around. We could spend another year doing that. We must have a sense of where we're going with the transition. There might be another referendum or vote then. But that's why I posed that question, and I may have posed it rhetorically to you. But if we change our minds and we can't unpick Article 50 without too much problem, then the issue of how we get back into the EU and whether we get back in with the same opt-outs that we already have is a very, very difficult question, and not one that we're quite ready to ask ourselves yet.
Thank you. So we take two more very short questions, or maybe comments.
Oh, no. I want to say, transnational academic cooperation. Oxford University has finally got its act together. It's going to hope for association of some sort, at least in the educational field. You may call that cherry picking. I call it a sine qua non of good academic research. In Oxford alone, between 17 and 21% of our students, our research money, and our teaching staff are all from the European Union. That's one hell of a hole to fill. So any transnational projects, yes, please.
So I think it's only fair that Steven Blockmans has a word once again, please.
And then there was one behind.
Yes.
Thanks very much. And I can assure you that I was not self-commiserating. On the issue of rule of law and values, which has been a red thread throughout this conference, I would like to ask you to entertain a few of the thoughts and arguments that I've put forward in protecting the EU's own values, the merits of its own enlargement policy vis-à-vis Turkey. Simply dismissing it out of hand as be careful what you wish for is not enough an argument, I feel. Maybe you can spell out what the dangers are. We've heard some of them by Professor Raik, some of them also by the Turkish ambassador. And referring back to Luc van Middelaar's position yesterday, saying that the EU, especially the European Council and the member states, are coming of age, if you want, in dealing with geopolitical issues, ought we not to take as a union a bit more own initiative to stand up for our own values in this respect too?
Thank you. And we take another, please, short question or comment from Matthew Karnichnik, and then we have to leave it there. Sorry to anybody else who asked for the floor.
Yes, I just had a very short question, which was, as a student of history, and assuming that the UK does leave the European Union and that there's not another referendum, where do you see the UK's place in the world after Brexit, say 5-10 years down the road? Thank you.
Well, it depends what kind of deal we get. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Canada Plus. I think the EEA is a non-runner, really. I've always thought it was a non-runner. We will be diminished. We will be poorer as a start, at least in the 5 years down the line. We've had a devaluation of just about 20% so far. The short-term spike that appeared to be in investment and employment and growth is leveling off, as you of all people will know very well. So I think we will be a much smaller island. We will seem to shrink physically in the global map. That's not just because of Brexit, it's because of other global forces. And those the world goes on. We've forgotten that in Britain, but the other major powers, the major players, the China, Asia, American dimensions, will change the configuration. If there is some sort of major outbreak of military hostilities, I think all options are off the table, frankly. We just keep our fingers crossed. But if there is a gradual decline, I think it will feel like that. I think that the next generation of Brits will want to get back in again. It then becomes a question of what kind of European Union it is, whether it's closed its borders to everybody or just to some countries. But I don't think we'd get back in without some kind of commitments to the euro, for example, if we leave completely. Stephen, you were being provocative, I was being provocative. I think there's a huge difference between saying we will carry on negotiating. The ambassador rehearsed very eloquently the chapters that we've done already. There are huge problems for Turkey, and I have former students who are working out there, and it's a difficult place to live in at the moment, partly for those external factors, which the ambassador also elaborated. But I think that psychologically and politically, there is a vast difference between saying niet, no, and being saying mañana. We take it slowly. We will use that leverage that we have, because if you say no, you lose your leverage, your capacity to have channels of communication with those inside the country. So I think there is a big difference between... I agree with you. I think ENP was a mistake. I would probably go further than you on actual ENP as being a mistake. But I think to say that an international institution which has always been voluntary, has always been open to accession, to say now is the time to say no, will have detrimental effects in the diplomacy for the region, first of all, but secondly, in the kind of institution that we now see ourselves as. But that's a partial reply, I know.
Thank you.
You're going to chuck me off now, aren't you?
Yes. Yes, it is time to thank once again Professor Anne Deighton, and also to thank all the other speakers, all the participants, everyone who has been involved in making this conference happen. It's very rare to see such a number of thinkers, experts, intellectuals discussing Europe simultaneously here in Tallinn. So it has been indeed a rare experience, and I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to help organizing it. That's what I told to the students whom we asked to join us as volunteers, that this is a rare chance to discuss the EU and see the impressive intellectual minds who work on the EU. And I wasn't quite sure how impressed they would be, because when I was a student, the EU used to be very attractive. But as we have heard from the discussions, it has lost quite a lot of its shine over the past few years. But I'm very grateful that our volunteer students came nevertheless. They helped us. Some of them are somewhere there right now. Thanks to all of them. And I would also like to thank in particular 3 people who have been closely involved in working on the conference. First of all, Glen Järats over there, who is director of the European Integration Office of Estonian government. He has been, first of all, willing to make this conference happen, supportive all along the way, so thank you, Glen. Secondly, I want to thank Professor Marek Tam, also for making an intellectual and also very practical contribution in many ways. It has been so great to work with you on this. And then, last but not least, Also from the Government Office of Estonia, Arle Soeson has been doing the hardest part of the work. I don't see her now. She's probably somewhere behind the scenes. But it has been a great pleasure to work with her as well and with everybody else. Arle is there. Thank you very much for all your hard work to make this conference happen. And of course, thank you to all the other colleagues from the Government Office of Estonia and all the other colleagues from the universities and elsewhere who have been involved and helped.
But as I have the mic, no, I don't have the mic, but I have a big voice. I'm sure that everyone in the room would actually also want to thank you, as well as your team, for an amazing combination of politicians, diplomats, academics, hangers-on, bureaucrats, civil servants, and of course students. For you, the students, are the next generation that have to keep this show on the road. But I think that the thanks are really owed to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So, and have a safe trip back home, everyone who is heading to the airport. The conference is closed. Thank you.